Good afternoon. I want to thank you all for joining us here today and welcome you to our webinar presentation, Disruptive Forces in Higher Education. My name is Cheryl Kozakowski and I'm the Director of Graduate Admissions here at Path College. Joining me today is our guest speaker, Dr. Melissa Morriss-Olson, Provost of Path College. Before we get started, I'd like to take a minute and orient you a bit to this online environment. Just under our welcome message in the questions box, you will see an empty box. You can type in your questions here, click send, and we will be able to read these and respond to you. We will answer all questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to type them in at any time. Just to give you a little background on Path College, we were established in 1897, and so we have a long history of providing educational opportunities in the Pioneer Valley and now across the country with our online graduate programs. Our physical campus is located in Western Massachusetts in Longmeadow, where we offer traditional undergraduate programs for young women, in addition to our undergraduate and graduate programs for adult learners. We are fully accredited by the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, which is the same exact accreditation that all of the state colleges and Ivy League schools in the New England region carry. At Path College, we offer our graduate programs weekday evenings and online, and there's absolutely no residency requirement for any of our online programs. We use state-of-the-art technology at Path. Our online classes utilize the Canvas learning system, and our faculty are specially trained in teaching in this online forum. All online graduate students are also trained to learn in this environment. We require that all students go through an online orientation course, no credits, to make sure that you start your first online class, you're ready to begin, and have all the tools you will need to be successful. A graduate degree from Path is also very affordable. There are no hidden fees. All you pay for is tuition and books. At Path, you will receive plenty of personal attention from the time you first inquire with our admissions office through your experience here as a student in our classes. Our professors really get to know their students and are vested in their successes. Throughout the year, Path hosts many online and on-campus events, including a Women's Professional Development Conference. This year, our featured keynote speaker is Barbara Walters. We are very excited. In addition, we also host nonprofit and higher education hot topics breakfasts, which are a series of professional development webinars, and there are many other events throughout the year that we invite you to get involved with. This leads me to our online Master of Science in Higher Education Administration program. It's your turn to be the student, and your classroom is entirely online. You can choose your area of concentration: general administration, enrollment management, fundraising, or online teaching and program administration. And whether you're in a public university or a private college, you'll be joining theory with practical application because your professors have been there. They worked at higher education institutions from all over the globe. The Master of Science in Higher Education Administration connects you to the most current issues in education and to a network of professionals in colleges and universities throughout the country. You will be building an invaluable library of resources, knowledge, and people. Our program consists of 12 courses, which can be completed in 12 to 24 months. The program has 3 start dates: March, June, and October. And at this time, it is my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Dr. Melissa Morriss-Olson. Welcome, Dr. Morriss-Olson.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I just want to add my words of welcome. I am delighted to be online with you today during this noon hour and to have the opportunity to talk for a little while about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And that topic is higher ed disruption. This is the agenda that we're going to cover over the next 30 minutes or so. And by way of a little bit of context, let me just say the following. I am a longtime student of higher ed. I've had the good fortune to work at 2 colleges that have turned themselves around in the midst of highly challenging times. And at both institutions, I worked with presidents who I think did all of the right things. My doctoral dissertation focused on this topic, and the question I pursued was this: essentially, how does one lead and manage during disruptive times so as to ensure and strengthen institutional viability? My research resulted in a book that summarizes my findings, and in brief, I think the most important takeaway from my research and the book is that there are clear, statistically significant factors that can be helpful for explaining the success of some institutions, particularly institutions that have found their way and are able to thrive when the context in which they are situated is very difficult. So I'm going to return to that at the end when I'm talking about what can we do if we're in a role within an institution and we're trying to impact viability. Net, this research, in tandem with the experience that I've had over my 30-plus years in higher ed, have shaped my thinking about how best to respond and manage during disruptive times. And so what we're going to do is start with some context that I hope that you'll find helpful in terms of understanding disruption. I want to quickly walk through what those game-changing forces are that, when put together, are creating such a difficult context for most of us. And then I will end with implications and how might we best respond. I love this little cartoon. I found it a long, long time ago, and when I first saw it, I thought, oh, that sure explains how I sometimes feel working as a higher ed administrator, and how I know my colleagues have described how they feel. When I say that higher ed is in the midst of incredible disruption, I think this is perhaps an understatement. For those of us who work on a campus level, you can perhaps relate to this image of change coming at you from just about every angle, every direction. Now, an understandable response, and I have felt this response, is to ignore, put our heads down, just keep plowing ahead. Because after all, that's the kind of response that has sometimes worked for us and for higher ed in the past. And yet, a great deal of evidence suggests that these times in which we currently live are indeed different from anything that we've experienced in the past. That unlike previous difficult eras in higher ed, the confluence of several significant disruptions sets the stage for a cataclysmic jolt that is unfolding now as we speak. And these are some of those forces that I'm going to be talking through in just a few minutes. So what do I mean by disruption? Dr. Clayton Christensen of Harvard is probably the one who first coined the term disruptive innovation. He is the person who's widely credited with this notion of disruption that applies to what's happening in higher ed today. And this is his definition. Disruptive innovation is the process by which a sector that has previously served only a limited few because its products and services were complicated, expensive, and inaccessible is transformed into one whose products and services are simple, affordable, and convenient, and serves many, no matter their wealth or expertise. Now, we are probably all familiar with examples of industries that have been disrupted. If you think about the transoceanic sailing ships that sailed many, many years ago, disrupted by the first commercially successful steamship that traveled from one continent to the other. Railroads being disrupted by automobiles. The horse-drawn vehicle industry disrupted by lower-priced Ford Model T when it first came out in 1908. The traditional publishing industry disrupted by desktop and digital publishing capabilities. Chemical photography disrupted by digital photography. Do you remember those old cameras of the past? These are some of the examples, but I'm sure that if I opened up the mics that you could probably add to this list. Now, in nearly every one of these cases, and in the research that Dr. Christensen did when he was first coming up with his thinking about disruption, there were three things that were true and common across all industries. First of all, is this notion that disruption does not happen overnight. It tends to be an evolutionary process. And this is a really important point to keep in mind, because given that disruption doesn't happen overnight, when it first starts to emerge, it's very common for people within that industry to ignore it, or to say, oh, you know, this is never going to take hold. This isn't something we have to pay attention to, because it's very quiet in some ways in terms of the way it emerges. A second point is that at first, disruption is oftentimes, almost always, a more expensive, a less reliable, and an inaccessible service to the population at large. So if you think back to, for example, those oceanic steamships, and then what replaced it. Many people, when that first came about, said, oh, there's no way, this is too expensive an option for the general public to even take advantage of. But what happened, and this leads us to the third point, is that over time, as the disruption is improved, as the technology surrounding that disruption is improved, it eventually gets to the point where those barriers to the public are significantly reduced to the level that the disruption begins to impact the viability of the competition. And I think if you look in higher ed today, if you look at what the press and the buzz has been surrounding MOOCs, I think that's a great example. MOOCs came on the scene almost, you know, without much fanfare at first. And for the first year that MOOCs, and by MOOCs I mean massive open online courses, that phenomenon, for the first year or so, much of the buzz surrounding MOOCs was that, oh, these are not going to last, there's too many problems with them, and so on. But in the last, I guess 2012 was the year of the MOOCs, according to some sources. Since 2012, there have been some incredible advances in terms of the technology, and the language has changed, and the projections have changed in terms of the role and the value of MOOCs across all levels of higher ed. So I think, again, the net takeaway here is that over time, the disruption oftentimes does become much more viable. In some cases, the disrupted industry goes out of business altogether. In other cases, the industry being disrupted was retooled or retooled itself so that it was able to survive, but in a different format or in a different model. So if you think about the publishing, the old-fashioned publishing houses, and how they have evolved now into, in some cases, digital publishing centers that are virtual in entirety, that's a great example of an industry that has retooled itself in order to survive, albeit in a different form. Okay, so what are those game-changing forces? There are at least 7 forces currently impacting higher ed that, when taken together, have the potential to cause similar disruption for our industry. And what's interesting, I did this talk a year ago. I identified 4 game-changing forces. Given what's happened just in the last year alone, I've expanded my list to 7. And I think each of these that you see on the screen in and of itself is significant, but it's when you put them all together that you can see how the sand is shifting in terms of the context for higher ed. So let's go through each of them quickly, starting with demographics. And if you work in higher ed, I don't have to tell you that the shifting demographics are impacting all of us. Shrinking traditional 18-year-old market, unlike previous times, this shrinking phenomenon is more significant, and I'll show you some slides in just a second. A second factor here is the extent to which enrollment behavior is much more fluid than it has ever been. Students transfer in and out, students transfer from 4-year colleges back to 2-year colleges. It's a much, much more fluid environment than ever. The notion of going to one institution and staying there for 4 years and getting your degree is increasingly a less common phenomenon for many 18-year-olds. Increasingly diverse, another way in which the demographics are shrinking. There are fewer 18-year-olds, but the market, the pool that is there, is increasingly diverse and less prepared in the traditional ways. And then we have a totally new kind of learner in the classroom that has huge impacts for the way we teach and learn. So let me talk a little bit about some of these specifically. This chart gives you a sense as to just how the growth rate has declined since 1963. The real heyday of higher ed was the 1960s to 1980. Then the growth started to decline, and the projection, 2012, over the next decade and a few years, is that we will decline. The rate of growth will slow even further, more significantly than ever before in the history of American higher ed. Now, if you consider the pipeline for colleges that depend on traditional age students, you can see by this chart that we really hit a peak in 2012. We're now in a state of decline. And even though we may be going back up to another peak, boy, 2024, if we live that long, some of you will, I'm sure. What's significant here is that the demographics are shifting in such a way that we will not all benefit from the increase equally. And let me tell you what I mean by that. If you look at the projected change in numbers of new high school graduates over the next decade, you'll see that depending upon what state you live in, what region of the country, you're going to benefit from the demographics differently. And so if you're in New England, like Path College, we are being impacted in a very negative way in terms of the pipeline, because the states from which we primarily draw are those states that are projected to decline, to decrease most significantly. Whereas if you're in the Pacific Northwest, if you're in Oregon, or if you're in the western states, most of those states are projected to experience growth. Now, another way in which the demographics are shifting have to do with the composition of the pool. So even though some states will experience growth in terms of the number of 18-year-olds, overall we're in the midst of a significant drop in the number of white public high school graduates. And so what this means is that I think all of us have to really ask some hard questions about how prepared we are to recruit, to enroll, and to serve students of color. And I think many of us will see over the next decade a significant shifting to the point that our white students are probably the minority. Here's another graph that makes this point even more significantly, going out to 2027, and you can see Asians are projected to grow most significantly, followed by Hispanics, and the bottom line is the white non-Hispanic. And again, these data come from WICHE, WICHE.edu, the Western Interstate Commission on Higher Ed. It's a great source if you're looking for statistics of any kind on higher ed and trends over the next decade. They are really the go-to source for higher ed statistics. Okay, now the final point I want to make here in terms of demographics is this shift in terms of a new kind of learner in the classroom. And I love this, this cartoon here. I have two teenagers, and this is my reality at home. So the digital natives coming of age, these are the individuals who have been born in the iPad, the iPod era, who have only known a life where the digital experience is integrated into all aspects of their life. And the implications for how we then design our learning experiences on any college campus are enormous. What many of my colleagues, other provosts, other institutions are telling me is that never before have they experienced such a disconnect between how their faculty teach and what today's learners are looking for in terms of a learning experience. And I thought this graphic was a really helpful one in terms of understanding what the difference is between how digital natives prefer to learn and how digital immigrants, which most of our faculty would fall under the digital immigrant category, how they prefer to learn. And you can see the potential for a real mishmash. I think this is one of the most significant issues that colleges will need to face in the years ahead. I know here at Bay Path, our faculty are doing some incredible things thanks to a Title III grant that we received a couple years ago. We're integrating the use of the iPad into the classroom so that students are able to use technology to create and share their own content. They're able to access each other and their faculty 24/7. We have faculty who are creating flipped learning experiences so that students are spending less time in the seat, and the time that they are spending in class they're using in a much more creative and hands-on way. We're just scratching the surface in terms of the kinds of things that we need to do at Bay Path. But this is, from my perspective, one of the most critical issues that all colleges need to face if they are going to be able to connect with today's learner and ensure that the education that they're providing is viable and is in keeping with what the 21st century workplace is going to demand of our graduates. Okay, so let's go to the second, and I'll go through the rest of these fairly quickly. The second disruptive force has to do with the cost pressures that many, if not most of us, are facing that come in tandem with this diminishing perception that the public has of higher ed in terms of value. Now, what's causing the cost pressures? Several things. Diminishing state role, particularly in terms of funding of higher ed, a general economic slowdown that has impacted the ability of the typical family to pay, and declining confidence in higher ed to deliver, which impacts the public, but in particular families, and they're thinking about whether a college education is really worth it. So let me unbundle this a little bit. Enough is enough. If you look at this data on the change in median household income since 2000, you can see that families are no longer able, many families, to access the kind of funding that they once might have accessed in order to pay for a college education. They simply can't use their homes or other asset bases that they might have as ATMs in order to fund extemporaneous expenses like college. And I think especially for those who work at private colleges, we have become somewhat insensitive to pricing. I think there's been a belief out there that's been perpetuated that a higher price means higher quality and that we could get away with charging a higher price, that the public would accept that. I think those days are over. So another statistic, if you look at the funding from the state for higher ed, and for those of you who are in the public sector, I'm sure that you've experienced this tenfold. But both the appropriations per FTE students and total appropriations have dropped significantly since FY09 and are projected to continue dropping over the next several years. This was striking, and this came from an Inside Higher Ed survey of parents about college. And when surveyed, parents said that they were going to be very involved in the decisions that their children made about where to apply. I guess that's not surprising because this is the helicopter parent generation that now has children going to school. But what this means is that future students may never even get the opportunity to know about the potential of financial aid to reduce the payments expected of them and their families because their parents are limiting their choice set right from the get-go. So that's another piece to consider. Of the fastest growing segment of the college-going pool, what you see here is that we have those who are less able to afford our tuition prices. And so if you look at the median incomes of African American and Hispanic families, they are approximately 58% of the white families. But taking it a step further, even looking at those higher income families, you'll see that there's been quite a bit of erosion in the amount paid for college on a year-over-year basis by income level. And so it's really interesting to see these lines almost beginning to come together and to merge. There just isn't much difference in terms of the willingness to pay, whether you're high income or you're middle income or lower income. And that's, again, that's a new phenomenon. If you look back to 2009, 2010, the disparity was much more significant. The skills gap, and I think this speaks to the decline in the sense that the public has about the value of higher ed. These are actual headlines from major newspapers and journals that have been out there over the last 12 months. I'm sure that you have seen some of these, but the net here is that there is widespread public questioning about the value and quality of an American college degree. There is a sense that what's being delivered in college is just not what's needed, that college graduates are not graduating with what they need to get a good job, to keep a good job. They're not being well prepared. And, you know, I think if you read through some of these, there's some truth to what's being written. At the same time, I think the challenge, the implication here is that on an institutional level, we've got to go to much greater lengths to make the case for how we are in fact preparing students, and if we're not doing a good job, we should be addressing that in terms of the curriculum and the overall experience. And again, these are two more little graphs. If you look at the increase in the price of college tuition compared to consumer price, it's over a threefold increase, coupled with data that comes out on a fairly regular basis about how colleges and universities are increasing their administrative infrastructure at the same time that the prices are going up, and a lot of experts try to connect the dots here and say that what's driving the increase in college tuition, especially at private institutions, is this padding of non-essential employees that have nothing to do with the actual teaching and learning experience. Now, again, you can argue with this, but this is how the media is playing the data. So I think this says it all. Moody's 2013 updated higher ed outlook. And again, if you're not reading this, this is a great thing to look at every year. Put it on your calendar in January to look at what Moody is saying about the outlook for higher ed. Years of depressed family incomes and net worth, as well as uncertain job prospects for many recent grads, and a slight decline in the number of high school grads are creating enrollment pressure and weakened pricing power for colleges and universities. That's kind of dismal, isn't it? Okay, third disruptive factor. I never thought I would see this in my lifetime, I have to tell you, but it's really fascinating to see what's happening at the regulatory level. Regional accrediting agencies are rethinking everything. CHEA is the professional association that represents the regional accreditors. Their conference theme in January, innovation, disruption, and the status quo. What do we want for accreditation? And basically the entire conference was about how they need to change, how they're doing things to respond to the disruptions that are impacting all of higher ed. The U.S. Department of Ed is now acting like a startup. Fascinating. They are rethinking the value and the meaning of the credit hour. They are publicly questioning whether it makes sense to attach credit to seat time or whether there isn't a better way to assess learning. It's a great question. And they're demonstrating a willingness to support experimentation through their approval of the Southern New Hampshire University College for America initiative. Fascinating. So I think this is telling. A fourth disruptive force has to do with the growing prominence of new nonprofit educational innovators. And it's interesting, the Center for American Progress is a very traditional group, and their recent report came out in support of and actually praising Southern New Hampshire's competency-based education platform, the College for America. It's almost unheard of that they would come out in such strong support for something so innovative and non-traditional. Again, I think sign of the times. This is from the Southern New Hampshire website. If you're not familiar with what they're doing, you really need to look at it. They are probably the foremost trendsetter in terms of nonprofit higher ed innovation. They've grown from 2,500 students to 25,000 students in a few years. They're perhaps best known for this competency-based college for New America, where students can earn an associate's degree without ever attending college. They complete 120 competencies that are all self-paced. They have a coach at a cost that is virtually unreal, less than $5,000. I think it's a lot less than $5,000 for the entire associate's degree. Another example is Brandman University, and if I had the time, I would play this video for you. I would encourage you to go on their website and take a look at this video. What's striking about the video is that they promote heavily the fact that they are a non-profit provider focused entirely on supporting adult learners for career success. But they really hype their non-profit status. And I think, again, that's in response to the criticism that the for-profits have been experiencing in terms of their innovation. Brandman is an institution that actually started as a school within Chapman University. It was their School of Adult Learning. They broke off and went after separate accreditation status and separate 501c3 nonprofit status. They did serve 3,000 students at the time that they branched off, which was just a few years ago. I think it was 2009. They now serve 11,000 students, so they have grown from 3,000 to 11,000 students just over that time, and both Brandman and Chapman are under the umbrella of the Chapman Corporation. So it's a fascinating model. I would encourage you to watch the video, which is on their website. Again, it's all about promoting success for adult learners. The fifth force, has to do with the rise of the non-EDUs. These are the MOOCs that I mentioned earlier. 2012 was clearly the year of the MOOCs, massive online open courses. Tend to be free, going through lots and lots of innovation. Most of these MOOCs are collaborative kinds of initiatives where several institutions come together and offer courses. I just enrolled in my first MOOC a couple weeks ago with 18,000 students. It's fascinating, fascinating experience. General Assembly, established in 2011, now enrolls or serves 70,000 students. Can you imagine that? General Assembly is a global educational community that brings people together in a variety of formats. Some of what they do is offered online. They also go into major cities and offer community-based learning experiences on any number of topics that tend to be skill or practical based. When you complete the experience, you get a badge that actually pops up in LinkedIn. So they have a partnership with LinkedIn where you get badges when you complete these courses through General Assembly. And again, I've talked to people who've done this in New York City. To a person, they all thoroughly enjoyed the experience, said it was high quality, that they learned a lot. This is a great diagram for trying to explain an open online course, a MOOC. I think the takeaway here is that there are as many MOOCs and types of MOOCs as there are people in the world. The term MOOC was originally coined in 2008 for a large online course. Today, these are some of the characteristics that most MOOCs share. Typically, the content is not located in any one place on the web, but it can be drawn in from many, many places. There tends to be no specific requirements, but participants are required to stay up to date with rough schedules. And most MOOCs are free. The biggest MOOC out there is Coursera, and this gives you a little bit of data. What's striking here is that Coursera hasn't been in existence for all that long, and yet if you look at the growth, the number of courses, the chart on the left-hand side, the growth is striking. Just in the last year alone, there is no sign of decline. If anything, it's a steady upward line in terms of growth. You can see that students enrolling in MOOCs are coming from all over the world. This is the case, the MOOC that I'm in. There are 18,000 students. Most of them work in higher education from all over the world. It's fascinating. And you can see where most of the courses are being offered currently in terms of MOOCs, science, arts and humanities, and information technology. And this just shows you a little bit about some of the questions. There are probably two primary criticisms about MOOCs, and this goes back to this notion of the questioning that the public has generally whenever there's a new disruptive kind of innovative force that comes on the market. One of the issues has to do with the fact that the completion rate for the typical MOOC is very, very low. And so the criticism has been, well, what good is it really doing? A lot of the technology that is now being developed is aimed at trying to strengthen the completion rate for students. A second criticism is that most of these MOOCs, what they're finding is that they tend to enroll highly educated individuals, those who already have a degree. And so the notion that a MOOC can be helpful for broadening access to people without a degree is something that appears, at least at this point in time, not to be necessarily true. But again, I think that's something that we can watch over time as the MOOC technology is improved. I think there's a lot of promise there in terms of broadening access to those without a degree. And as more and more institutions show a willingness to give credit for a MOOC experience, I think there you're going to see as well possibilities opening up in terms of the access question. Okay, so the final factor has to do with what so many people have been writing about, and that is that we're living in the midst of a huge convergence between the physical world and the digital world, and perhaps this, more than anything, is driving the pace of change. What does this mean? It's really nothing more complicated than a coming together of two or more distinct entities or phenomenon. So if you think about the iPad, for example, and I see this on our campus in terms of how the iPad is changing the teaching and learning experience. Through the iPad, students are extending their learning rather than having classroom learning be the beginning and the end of the educational experience at Baypath. The fact that their iPad connects them to each other and to their faculty from wherever they might be 24/7, that's the kind of convergence of the physical world and the digital world that is so powerful in terms of changing the game and the paradigm that we have thought about in terms of teaching and learning. The flipped classroom is another great example, and the flipped classroom, a really crude definition, is moving the content that might be typically delivered through a lecture out of the classroom so that they're getting that content in another way, maybe through videos that they watch that the professor has put together, or maybe content that's been downloaded from some MOOC platform that's out there. The students are assigned to watch the content or to get the content in some other way, and then when they come into the class, they're using that learning through hands-on and customized kinds of experiences that take place in the classroom. Again, what you have is a convergence of digital and physical and a learning experience that is not bound by space or time. It's fascinating. And if you look at this, you have to look at this just for a second. It's not as complicated as it looks at first blush. But what this is showing is the range of educational delivery models that we now have available. And if you think about it, 10 years ago, what you had was mostly the traditional nonprofit and the face-to-face. It was a much more monolithic in terms of the primary educational paradigms. Now you can see the range from face-to-face to blended hybrid to online courses to fully online, but then even for fully online courses you have a range from cohort-based to self-paced. You have for-profit, you have nonprofit, you have delivery models, flipped classroom, competency-based, faculty-specific courses versus MOOCs. And I think the challenge for most of our educational institutions is to say, okay, where do we fit here? For the things that we're going to deliver, for our mix of programs, where are we going to put a stake in the ground, because one of the things I'm going to tell you as I end this as a takeaway is that most of us are not resourced to do it all, and most of us shouldn't be doing it all. So figuring out where on this map to put the stake in the ground and build our strategy in terms of the programs that we are best equipped to deliver now and into the future is one of the most strategic decisions that most of us need to be making. And I'm not sure how many of us are even having this conversation on an institutional level. So how do we respond? And that's what I want to end with. Just a few thoughts as to how we might best respond as organizations and as leaders. I love this. Wait, listen to me. We don't have to be just sheep. And that's the first message that I want to leave us with. First and foremost, it is so critical to know and to leverage our organization's DNA. Every college has its own unique DNA. Even if you've never taken the time to figure it out, I believe every institution has something that sets it apart. Seldom, if ever, has a truly exceptional institution emerged that was not driven by some distinctive and compelling identity. So this is recommendation number one: know and leverage your distinctive core competencies. Like Brandman, they put the stake in the ground and said, you know what, we're going to be the place, the nonprofit place for adult learners focused on career success. So they don't offer anything that is not practical and aimed at getting adult learners into jobs. That's their niche, and they have leveraged the wazoo out of it. Be bold. Avoid the tendency to follow the leader. Again, going back to that map, you cannot do everything well, but every single one of our institutions has the capacity to do something better than anyone else. Our challenge is to figure out what that is and to leverage it as far as we can. Number two is, and this is going to seem a little bit like a contradiction to what I just said, but I think at the same time it is so critical that we develop the organizational capacity to be mindful. And not just as individual administrators, but to cultivate a sense of mindfulness across our organization so that our organization really develops a mindset of being wide awake. And that's what I mean. There's been a lot of talk about mindfulness. There's actually some fascinating research out of Harvard about the application of mindfulness to learning. And they have found that to whatever extent students practice mindfulness, it will increase their chances of retaining what they're learning and their chances for success in the classroom. Well, that's the same kind of thing, but applied here, what I'm talking about is making sure and training yourself to be wide awake, resisting this autopilot way of thinking that so many of us get into. If you think about how often you go through the day, you sit in meetings, and you don't question. You don't ask hard questions about why you're doing things the way you are. So, for example, when is the last time you did a comprehensive audit in your organization, an honest assessment of what is working or what is not? Most of what we do in higher ed was put in place to meet the needs of an industrial society, and yet the world around us is so very different. And so in terms of practicing mindfulness, I want to recommend we accept that this time truly is different, that you know your environment, that you really, really get smart about the environment in which you're operating, that you know who your competition is, that you know what your competitors are doing well and what your advantages are and limitations vis-a-vis the competition. It can be helpful to study successful examples in other industries. Avoid limited thinking. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in meetings where people have said, well, we just don't have the money to do that, or it will never work. I want to encourage you to be the one to push back and say, but wait a minute. Is there a way to do this without the resources? Is there a way to get those resources? Broaden your self-image. We tend to define ourselves as organizations based on our past history or performance. Again, the pace of change is so rapid that the past is not relevant for most of us anymore. So it's critical to broaden your self-image. One of the ways you can do that is by inviting outsiders into your organizational decision-making and discussion. When's the last time you brought somebody in from outside your institution and asked for their input? Absolutely critical to have people at the table who don't have biases or who have not been in your setting for so long that they already think that they know what the answer to the question is going to be. Again, things are so different that it is critical that we be wide awake and questioning everything that we're doing. Okay, the next one. Diversify strategically, but mindfully. I want to keep those two things together. In my research, this was one of the most important strategies for success. Pursuing a diverse and a broad mix of strategy increases the chances that something will work to counteract those things that may not work. It's critical that you find ways to preserve and that you leverage sources of opportunities. Even if you are constrained, you must find ways to experiment. Those small colleges that have only served the 18 to 22-year-old population they're in a very tough time now if they do not find ways to broaden the mix, but to do it strategically and mindfully. Again, keeping in mind that we cannot do it all. Another recommendation is to think alliances. And this kind of goes against the grain of how we do things in higher ed. We tend to think silos. And yet the lessons from other industries suggest that survival often depends on collaboration, even with our competitors. So a MOOC is a great example of how some higher ed institutions are collaborating to broaden their self-image and to do things that they otherwise might not have been able to do. They're doing it in collaboration with others. So get out of your own way. Begin to broaden the way you think about the resources that you have access to. So it's not just your institution, but who else is out there who has a reason to want to collaborate with you or who could benefit from collaborating with you. What initiatives might benefit the greater good? I always encourage my students to develop a collaborator map. And it can be a great exercise for a group of administrators at an institution to identify who are those entities that, if merged with us, or if we could do something in tandem, could benefit both of us. Avoid the zero-sum game mentality. Very, very critical. And that, I think you know what I mean. That has to do with this notion that if I collaborate, I'm going to lose something and that I can't get back. Look at everything through a student-centered focus, and I think this goes along with much of what I have been already saying. If you were to truly and wholeheartedly focus on serving students' needs, how might you need to change on your campus? For example, how seamless is your enrollment experience? How easy is it for students to transfer in and out and back in again to your institution? Do you make it easy, or do you put up barriers that keep students from being able to transfer in and then come back out? The calendar, the scheduling, the way you have designed learning experiences, how student-centered are they? Again, I would recommend, and I recommend this to all institutions, that it's critical to do an audit from the perspective of the student. Structure, role, processes, policies. What do your students need to be successful, and how well is the campus experience set up to promote that success? Something that a lot of people have been writing about in the last year is this adaptive learning theory. Again, if you're not up to speed on that, I highly recommend that you learn as much as you can about adaptive learning theory. I think this is one of those game-changing forces that is going to really have an impact on how we're designing teaching and learning experiences. And it's really nothing more than adapting the way one teaches and the learning experience to the individual needs of each student. And this is a great resource at EDUCAUSE for learning more about adaptive learning. Okay, and I'm going to end with this notion of interpretive leadership. In my research, this was one of the big things that helped to account for the success of institutions. In difficult times, leaders of thriving institutions base their decisions and their actions on symbolic values as much as structural and more substantive one. And the finding in my research corroborated what many who do research on successful college management practices, what they found, and that is that finding things that can have symbolic value for a campus community are very, very critical. They can serve as a rallying point to energize and to focus the campus community, which can then create this this sense of momentum that can carry an institution through difficult times and also free up the psychic energy to imagine a different future and to be creative so as to come up with things that could be beneficial for the institution. So an example might be a name change. Something as simple as a name change can have huge symbolic value for an institution. I knew of one president, brand new president, who arrived at a campus that was really stretched financially. People were disillusioned, they were depressed, and he wound up making a very difficult decision to purchase a neighboring campus and to restructure the whole campus environment. And people, they were naysayers. The criticism he got on the front end was, well, this will never work. Well, long story short, after 2 years, looking back, that decision, the purchase of that neighboring campus, and then all the things that happened in association with it, that was the linchpin for turning that institution around and for setting the institution on a very, very different trajectory. It was a significant enough event that it was a game changer. And I think every president should have a few symbolic actions in his or her pocket, especially early on in a presidency. But I think that's true for all of us. So I'm going to stop there. That's a lot of information that I went through very quickly. I would be happy to answer questions, and I'm going to ask, I'm going to turn the mic, or I'm going to turn the control of the PowerPoint back to Cheryl, and I'm going to ask her to read off the questions that are coming in, because I can't actually, for some reason, I can't see them on my screen. But again, thank you so much for your patience, for being with us, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have or just observations. I'd be happy to hear what observations you have or things that you may be experiencing that relate or resonate or illustrate any of these points. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Morriss-Olson, for that fantastic presentation. This is Cheryl again. And while you're typing in your questions, just wanted to bring to your attention, we are hosting our next webinar, information up on your screen, called Tapping into Passion, 10 Steps of Donor Cultivation, taking place on Thursday, April 3rd at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Hosted by Dr. Derek Wesley, Provost and Scholar of Higher Education. This concludes this portion of our presentation. At this time, I would like to open it up for questions. I will go ahead and read the questions, and we will answer those for you. Thank you so much for being here. We have some excellent questions that some of you have posted. The first one is, are you referring to the achievement gaps in education?
That's a great question. I'm assuming that you're asking in reference to my information about the diminishing value of higher ed, and I think the achievement gap is one thread in terms of that. Interestingly, I think this is one of those things that has many definitions depending upon who you ask. If you were to query business leaders, they tend to talk in terms of skill gap, that there's a gap in terms of the skills that they need and what college graduates are coming out with. I think the achievement gap is another way of getting at that, although it may mean something slightly different depending upon who's talking about it.
Fantastic, thank you. Our next question is, are MOOCs similar to correspondence schools?
Oh, that is a great question. Based on my experience of the last few weeks, I would have to say that the MOOC that I'm enrolled in is nothing like a correspondence school course. Now, a correspondence course, in terms of what that is, the old correspondence course model was one where you would get your materials through the mail, and you would have things you would have to complete, and then you would send them somewhere, and somebody would read and evaluate and then send back they would evaluate and send it back to you. But again, there's a lot of colors and shapes in terms of correspondence courses. With MOOCs, I think there are many things that are different. Typically, when you are in a MOOC, you're in this experience with a whole bunch of other people. A correspondence course is a solo kind of experience. It's you and whoever's evaluating. In my MOOC, I'm learning with 18,000 other people from around the world. And the MOOC is structured so that I have individual assignments I have to do, but then I can go to group sessions on a weekly basis. So I can actually sign in and chat with other students and with somebody who's facilitating the MOOC. And I think MOOCs are moving more and more toward this combination of some kind of dynamic learning experience to take advantage of the community that you are a part of. So I hope that answers, but again, like correspondence courses, there are such a wide variety of MOOCs. It's hard to define them in a monolithic way because there's so much variety.
Great, thank you. Just a real quick question, it looks like. Will you be able to share these slides with us after the webinar? Yes, we will be going ahead and emailing this presentation out to everyone who has attended today's Special Topics webinar. We have a great comment, excellent speaker. Thank you. Thank you very much to Dr. Morriss-Olson. Since we are hitting 1 p.m. here, we'll stay on for the next couple of minutes and take any last questions. Please feel free to type those in now. Okay, if there are no further questions, I just want to thank you all so much for participating in today's session. Feel free to contact us with any additional questions you may have. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Yes, thank you.